Are we ready to go? I'd like to call the meeting of the Joint Airport Zoning Board to order. Secretary will take note of the roll. Next item of business is to approve the minutes of the December 13th, 2021 meeting. Any corrections, amendments, additions?
No.
If not, the motion would be in order to approve the minutes.
I move to accept the minutes.
We have a second.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Next item under old business is to review the edited zoning ordinance and authorize staff to send draft ordinance out for agency review. Brian Page is here from the firm of Mead and Hunt, and you are acting as consultant to the city for this project.
That is
And
correct.
I understand that you will be handling the presentation on this item.
That is correct.
You may proceed.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Again, as the chairman has introduced me, I am Brian Page. I am with Mead and Hunt. We are the consultant for the airport that is assisting the city with this zoning update that we are currently engaged in. And we also serve as the airport consultant and have done so for roughly the last 20 or so years. And at any rate, to move into this process, Joe, is this water for me or?
It is for
Okay,
you,
great,
yep.
wonderful, thank you. I'll need that.
There should be one for each of you if you need it.
And think about everything, thank you. Okay, the first thing I kind of wanted to do tonight is I wanted to go back and acknowledge that we did receive some comments after the last meeting. And what I wanted to do is at least acknowledge those comments. And I think what we'll do is just save them for kind of when we walk through the overall draft of the program and kind of show you and answer the questions that we had. Some of it was more grammatical in nature, so those edits have been made, and certainly if there are any additional ones, you know, safety zones and that sort of thing, let us know, and we'll certainly address those in the next update. But in terms of some of the drawings and so forth and some of the detailed information, I'd like to reserve that. We do have the drawings that we can kind of walk through that will kind of make it a little bit easier conversation for us to have. So if that's okay, Mr. Chairman, that'll be how we'll proceed.
Is that acceptable to the members? Okay, please proceed.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. And again, this is a process that we have started last fall, and we are making some excellent headway. The next step, as the chairman has explained, is going to be to kind of finalize this draft document. Once we're in agreement on this draft document, the next step will be as it makes its first presentation to the state of Minnesota. State of Minnesota will take a look at the Department of Transportation, Office of Aeronautics. They'll take a look at it and then get us back any sort of comments that they may have. Then the next step would be is to address any of their comments and then set up the first public hearing is kind of what's on the radar. There's other steps involved, and we'll kind of talk about that toward the tail end and talk about next steps and then talk about the overall timeline. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We kind of ran through some of the introductions. The meeting purpose today, what I'd like to do is take a little bit of time and talk about exemptions. You're going to hear me talk a lot about that tonight because there are going to be some exemptions that we're going to be looking for. I'm going to suggest a few, but ultimately it's your decision to what you want to do as far as how you want to advance that to the state of Minnesota. But we'll talk through that, talk a little bit about the implications, what it means to actually have an exemption, and how that relates to this zoning going forward. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about some of the exceptions that we're going to be looking for are related to some properties that are in the various different approaches that either are properties that have been in existence prior to any of the zoning taking place. The previous zoning that we're adding on to or amending was actually adopted by the city back in 1984. So what we're talking about with this effort is kind of bringing it current with all of the different statutory changes and so forth. Probably the most significant happened back in 2019. That's when the state legislature actually revised the whole state zoning model, if you would, and that's what we're pursuing, and there were some changes that came out of that, so that's part of the reason why it's necessitating this change. In addition to some other things in changing environment at the airport, such as the addition of the runway, additional length on the runway, plus with the different changes associated with the crosswind runway. So that's actually what we're going to be talking about here tonight. So I thought what I would do is this drawing that's on your screen right now is a representation of what is currently inside the airport property boundary. You see all the colors, pretty colors that we have in there, plus the different shaded lines and so forth. But essentially what you see in this is colored is essentially what's under the current ownership of the airport. It does extend a little bit up to the north, across the highway and so forth, but just for the purposes of discussion, just kind of want to have this drawing. This drawing is your Exhibit A for the airport, which is an official document that's held by not only the Federal Aviation Administration, but also the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So that's where this drawing comes from, and this is, you know, basically a representation of everything currently owned by the airport. What this drawing represents is this is the airspace drawing around the airport. It gets kind of complicated, but you can see the main upshot to this is you can see how far it extends out with the various different zones. You get with the inner part that all those crazy lines that you see in trapezoidal shapes off the ends of the runway. All of those have a name and a representation when it comes to the FAA. And then when you step back and get further out from the runway, you have what's called a horizontal surface, which is essentially 150 feet above the defined airport elevation. And then from that point, it goes up even more at the what they call a conical surface around the airport. And the outer bank of that conical surface is what's represented on this drawing. We'll talk a little bit about the crosswind runway because I know there were some questions about some of the safety zones surrounding that. So we'll talk about that here in a bit. This drawing, what this is intended to represent is more or less kind of a step back and blown out view of the zoning that we're going to be imposing and updating around the airport. The zoning, as you can see, the parts in yellow in the trapezoidal shapes at the ends of each one of the runways represents the zones A, which is the longer of the two trapezoids. The shorter of the two trapezoids further away from the runway is zone B. And then that outer circumference that you see in the black dotted line, that's what's commonly referred to as zone C. And each one of those is defined in your document, so you can go back and refer to what each one of those zones represents and what's allowed and what isn't allowed. Yes?
In the document, it refers to safety zone A, safety zone B, and then to zone C. Should that be safety zone C, or is there a different zone that would be representing?
We could certainly be consistent. There's no distinguishing difference between safety zone A, safety zone B, and safety zone C in terms of how they're defined. There is differences now in each one of those, what those zones represents, but in terms of talking on the same language, it probably would be consistent all the way around to call it safety zone C. So we could certainly make that edit.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, as we get into and walk through some of the approaches, the first one up here tonight to talk about is this is actually the runway 15N. The runway 15N is up on the north side of the airport. It's the part that stretches across the highway and goes out in that kind of green space area between Menards and Walmart. And as you can see, we've got the end of the runway there and showing the 1,000-foot primary surface. And with Zone A, you can see that first part of it extends out and goes out quite far, even beyond Menards. And then when Zone A stops, it starts with the Zone B. Now, the Zone B and the Zone A, if you were to take the combination of those two, it comes out to be the same length as what the length of the runway is, what you're protecting, okay? So the Zone A being 2/3 of the runway length is the length of Zone A, and Zone B is 1/3 of the runway length. So 2/3, 1/3, you come up with a full runway length that you're protecting for. So as you can see, when you get to the far northern fringes, it actually stretches across and goes across, I believe that's the railroad tracks that are out there.
Correct, yes.
And it gets into, I think it's Americold cold storage, which is shown in kind of the magenta color, which is 2. And then it looks like it's a dairy AMPI, dairy transfer warehouse, if you would, that's on the opposite side of that road, shown in 1. Each one of those, and this is what we would have to talk through as a group, is each one of those, there are certain restrictions that come along with the Zone B requirements. Zone B requirements are such that, first off, the acreage, the minimum size acreage of each of the lots that's in Zone B has to be a minimum size of 3 acres. And then the next requirement comes with people. What they're trying to avoid is having like a big facility of some kind that's going to draw a lot of workers, a lot of population. So essentially what they do is they restrict that and essentially say the ratio is going to be you can't have any more than 15 individuals per acre. So in essence, in a 3-acre site, for example, you could have 3 times the 15, up to 45 different people is what that facility could support. And that would still fall inside of the zoning requirements. If it's anything more than that, then what you would have to do is you'd have to look at that and see whether or not that should be something you might want to consider exempting. And the question, I guess, that we would have at this point is you can see, and you probably have to really zoom in on your drawing or on your computer, but you can see that the facility that's right here in Zone 2 is just barely even being clipped by the end of the Zone B trapezoid. So it looks to me like there's several structures out there, just looking at the aerial view of it. So it's not just this. It's all the way going over to Highway 29. Mm-hmm. Okay. All the way over to Highway 29, it looks like there's probably 4 or 5 structures out there. So this piece right in here, you can choose to whether or not you would want to try to exempt that or not. Same thing with this. This gets a little bit more encompassing because you can see the structure on one, the trapezoid goes over and almost includes the entire structure. Now, should you or shouldn't you exempt it? I guess that's a question that you'd have to make as a JASB as to whether or not you felt that there was any need to put some restrictions on that property or not. If, say, for example, these 2 facilities are not going to have any more than 15 per acre, I think this site is much bigger, if I remember correct. This one, this one, this one.
Probably the
Probably one.
teal one, yeah.
Okay. So it gets back to the purpose of this body, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent any sort of non-compatible uses as popping up in the approach ends of the airport that could be a hazard to safety, not only to people on the ground, but the people flying as well. Are either one of those, do you feel worth asking for an exemption on, or do you think that if there's only going to be no more than 45 individuals on the Cyan, or the bluish colored one at any given time, and no more than 45 individuals on the magenta one at any given time, it probably wouldn't be worth asking for an exemption and including that part of it, which would mean that you would have zoning on this lot, on the magenta one, just between where their lot line is right here. And it preclude them from doing anything or developing right there, about where the bubble for the two is. This one might be a little bit more, you might want to think about that one a little bit. What's the plans of this property owner out here, and what are they gonna do, and would they build onto this? Go all the way out to the edge of the trapezoid? I guess I don't know. That would be something that you would have to have some discussions with those folks and find out what their intent is.
Question.
Yes, Chairman.
We currently have, airport zoning in place. And am I not correct that that zoning impacts these properties as shown on this
It
document?
does. But the zoning that's in place right now was for a much more expansive runway than what you have out there. So you're actually going to be pulling those zonings in a little bit rather than out, believe it or not. When the zoning is initiated in, just fundamentally, I guess the philosophy being, when you initiate your zoning, it's probably going to be a while before you're going to come back and revisit again as a community. So what you have to do is look at your planning and what the long-range comprehensive plan is for the airport at that point, and zone for where you're going into the future. So what they did back in the 1980s was based on what they thought at that time of what was going to ultimately happen with the airport. And at that time, it was going to be a longer runway. So that's hence how you got there with that. So yes, there is zoning in place, but how it impacts that property, that's kind of why we're here, because it doesn't really make sense today. You're trying to pull this back in and make it actually match with what you have in the existing condition.
Is it then correct that the way the lines are depicted when they go through a building, it's only that portion of the building that is subject to these requirements, or does it apply to the whole building?
That's a good question. I have seen MnDOT look at it from the perspective of just only what's defined inside the trapezoid. Because they don't really have this piece out here. That's not in the, so they can't, it shouldn't be something that's basically part of the zoning for control because it's outside of Zone B. So in my mind's eye, it would only be for what's inside the trapezoid, which in essence would mean on the magenta, there's not much of that building at all that's caught inside that. It's just that this area that's kind of by this, it looks like a windscreen or a tree buffer, whatever it is by the railroad here. It would just be about where the bubble is in that area there, that they wouldn't be able to put an additional part of the building. They could put a parking lot there. Mm-hmm. It looks like that whole area back there, from what I can see Googling it, it looks like they have a lot of trucks coming and going, so they pretty much put the whole thing in gravel. So it's possible that they might want to do that, and that's fine. That's no problem at all. That's a compatible use. What's a non-compatible use is all of a sudden if they put something out there that was so like an addition onto the building or something like that, and then put all their office space right there. That would be an issue.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, on number one, that building, if you look at the roof line, it is heading into the railroad right of way. So if they'd put any kind of big extension on there, it would take an angled extension, which is much more inclusive and stuff. It makes me wonder if they'd even want to do that. Second question I've got is, does anybody know, is that just, I'm guessing warehouse there as well, right?
Yeah.
Is anybody familiar with that out there?
Yeah, we actually, fire department, we did a walkthrough, half a year ago, sometime this summer, and it's just all cold storage.
And these people are aware of what we're doing here, right? Are they in the loop?
Not yet.
Not as of yet?
Once
Okay.
we get to the,
They will be at the public hearing. The public hearing,
Definitely.
they're gonna get a letter, the folks in the magenta, everybody's gonna get a letter.
But then the 15-person thing would hardly apply here because
Yeah, I think
not
they
for a
have
warehouse
maybe
situation.
10 employees out there at a given time.
Yeah.
Between all the facilities.
Everything, yeah.
Yep, so,
Are there two different owners between 1 and 2, or is it the
Yes.
same company?
Different owners.
So that is AMPI on number 1, okay.
I think so.
I was thinking AMPI was over on 14, but I'm not.
It could be, but it looks like it's some sort of a transfer operation. And again, just looking at the signs that are out there on Highway 29, it says that it's AMPI, so
Okay, all right.
No,
Just a-
AMPI
the
uses
firm-
both facilities, but
if you bring up the ownership of the property and the structure, it's some outfit out east somewhere. I can't remember where, maybe Pennsylvania or somewhere, so
I'm pulling
they're
it up
not
right
here
now.
locally.
So the area number 1, the 15 people per acre, that is assigned to the entire parcel? Or is it just assigned to the building?
It would be just assigned to the actual structure itself.
It is the same ownership.
It is?
Yep.
Okay. Note that. Thought it was different.
Different parcels, same owner.
But in terms of the site acreage for either one of those properties, one's 11.6 acres, the other one's 3.5 acres. 3.5 acres being the magenta. The 11 acres being the cyan colored. So both of those meet the criteria right now as far as site acreage, minimum site acreage is concerned. So the only thing is, I wouldn't have any idea, but I would venture to guess you're never going to end up with 15 people in that structure at any given time. But that would be something we would probably have to discuss at the first public hearing, and then you guys could make a decision at that point, unless somebody knows them and wanted to have a conversation with them prior to that.
I'm thinking they won't, unless it gets sold at some point,
Mm-hmm.
different owner, but that's not our concern.
Yeah, and I would agree with Board Member Berg that if they're gonna expand, they're gonna do a new building up to the north. They're not gonna tighten themselves up by going to the east. But I mean, we have local contacts for them, but you know, it's a corporation from Georgia, so that's who the notice will have to go to. But and maybe beforehand, it might be in our best interest just to contact the local management just to make them aware of the situation as well, which we can do.
Yeah, I think
Only-
that would be prudent, that we should let these people know that this is something that's under consideration. Not that they all of a sudden receive a notice and what is this and what does it mean?
You know, just I know one of the team members had brought up the point that why did they push that structure so far on the backside of an 11-acre lot? And is the railroad of importance to them?
Yes.
Was that the reason?
They do use a railroad. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So, you know, if they did build something else, that might be a consideration, that they want to be close to the railroad.
But again, that would be a warehouse-like facility, I would guess, you know,
Yep.
for that kind of access. And you still might not be dealing with that amount of people.
Yeah, their existing office is even in the next parcel to the north.
Okay.
So
Did you indicate how much of that building is located within your safety zone B?
The one in the
The blue,
cyan,
yeah.
how much of it,
Yeah.
square footage wise?
Square
No,
foot-
we didn't measure that, but we could. I mean, just
Okay.
based
Well,
on
that would
aerials.
determine then the number of people that would be allowed in that facility, or that portion of the facility.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like, again, it's some sort of a cold storage transfer operation that goes on there, so, you know, I can't gather that there would probably ever be that many people there,
Sure.
so, but it's hard to say, and I guess without talking to them, who knows?
So there's two impacts by this zoning would be the number of people in that building, and then the minimum acres that would have to be remain in that parcel in order to be compliant, because you have to be 3 or above, if I understood what you said.
Right.
So they couldn't split that parcel in half and still be compliant.
We make sure you're pulling the mics close so
Sorry.
Stephen can hear.
Just to be clear, it's only one parcel, or it's one landowner, but it looks like it's 2 parcels that are involved. So the other parcel would be treated differently. This piece over here, and I don't know if this is it looks like this must be a public right-of-way.
It's just a parcel
Okay,
owned by the same company.
okay.
So, parcel number 1 is currently 3.5 acres, if I understood what you said.
Parcel number 2.
2 is 3.5 acres. Okay.
Parcel number 1 was, you say 11 acres?
It looks like it's 11 acres. Yep.
But there's other restrictions too. There's height restrictions and use restrictions also.
And mainly this would be just handling the 2D restrictions because it's inside of Zone B. But there are also height limitations associated with it as well.
And use.
Yep. Yep. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions about that one? We'll move on to the next one, which this one is probably going to be the most time consuming, but I think we can probably manage to talk through this one. This is the south end. This is on runway 33 to the primary runway. And you can see that this one probably has the most non-conforming, I guess, land uses out there existing. And if you look at it, the areas that we have colored here, you see where Zone A comes out and basically forms the bigger trapezoid between the two. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8. A little bit of 6 that's actually in there as well. Now, each one of those properties is kind of unique in its own right, and I guess we could probably spend a little bit of time to kind of talk through them one by one. This landowner, I believe, is Landsteiner.
Mm-hmm.
This landowner, as you can see, where the trapezoid comes through, it barely clips, it looks like the house. And it looks like the house actually falls inside of the yellow trapezoid. Now, that being said, that property, being where it is and proximity to the end of the runway and so forth, and because this is on the edge, I believe that you could ask for an exemption on exempting that property, you know, from the zoning. And all of them that you see covered here would all be basically exemptions that you would be seeking, you know, through the process, which in essence means that this zoning does not apply to those properties. Now, if we go to 2, we gotta kind of keep all these on the right path here. If you look at 2 could ask for an exemption because of it would grandfather in because that property and that farm long existed prior to the zoning taking place. So that property, again, would be exempted from the zoning. Okay? Now I'm just going to move through these and kind of talk about them one by one. The next one would be 3. You might ask, well, why are we doing 3 at all? Well, 3 has got, it looks like this supposed to be a machine shed or something that this lawn structure, maybe some of you know what that is, but there's something out there that falls on that parcel. But again, okay. Again, that parcel is far enough, this parcel in age, that goes back to, according to the records here, it goes back into the 1940s. So with that being said, that property could be exempted again because of that, because of its age, okay? The other ones that we have in here, if we move to 4, The property right here in green, that property again, looking at the property parcel records and so forth, was first developed in the 1940s. So again, that predates 1978, so it'd be exempted, okay? This property, if we go over to 7, this one's a little bit harder to disseminate, I guess, what's going on here, but 7, it looks like, as far as the age is concerned, is more recent. It is almost 5 acres, but this one, and help me out if somebody knows different, but it looks like the access and the structure is right here. Basically right at the edge of where Zone A would be. So the vast majority of this area, I think, goes up that ravine or ditch line, right? So this parcel out here, theoretically, because it's at the far reaches of Zone A, is probably a little less from a safety standpoint of being an issue. So you could look at exempting that property for that reason. Now, the age part of it, this is the part that MnDOT's going to probably look into, because it was built in 1993. It was built at a period of time that presumably there was already zoning there. So why was it built, I guess, is going to be the question. But at the same time, it's there now, so probably the best thing to do would be is to ask for an exemption.
When you say 1993, that's when that structure you're talking is on a parcel was built?
I believe so.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
When you're talking about this, I'm going to be a little facetious here, but when you're talking about the safety factor, are you talking about the people in the dwelling or the flying or both?
Both.
Okay. Because with the flying, I think you're in the same hot water whether you're hitting that house or all those trees. So,
I agree.
yeah.
And that's usually the argument that we'll raise with MnDOT at that time. Again, basically how these zoning updates are governed is it does ultimately have to go before the Department of Transportation's commissioner, and a commissioner has to review this. And they will take all the notes and everything from staff at that point and make their determination whether or not they agree with you as a JASB or they don't, one of the two. So ultimately, it's going to be up to them to make that determination. But that's the argument that we've used in the past. It's
What if-
like, my goodness, I mean, they've got other things to worry about
If they go against, what's the recourse of the homeowners? Let's say the one that are built after the grandfathering. Got to
I
move?
don't believe that we'll get to there. But if we do, that's going to open up a whole different avenue of discussions that we'll have to have. But I don't believe that will go in that direction.
Yeah, based on what you've dealt with before. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, moving on to 8. 8 is, it looks like there has been some recent activity. I don't know what the original dates were, but it looks like there has been some fairly recent, I guess, construction on that site. But safe to say again, it looks like, I don't know these properties all that well, but just looking at the aerials and so forth, it looks like this is some sort of it's a structure, but it looks like it's some sort of a machine structure. I think the house is actually likely to be outside of the trapezoid.
That's where they are.
Okay. So if that's the case, I think we can make a strong argument to exempting that property again from.
Well, that would be grandfathering also. Is it,
I believe some of it, but it looks like, according to the records, some of those structures, and I don't know if it's the one that's actually inside, but some of that, there was some development, some significance that happened in 2013. So, again, we'd have to go back and evaluate it, but again, how hard we push with that if we're going to seek an exemption, it is probably not all that critical that we get down and parse through, I guess, what structure was built when, if the whole property is going to be exempt. So, with that, there are some other parcels that are on the drawing, as you can see, that basically get into Zone B issues. And from your if you follow along, I guess, in your handouts or the computer, it looks like all of the Zone B issues that we have out here with 9, part of 6, and 5, it looks like all of them are larger than 3 acres, or 3 acres minimum, which is good. So you have that, and since each one of those is a residence, each one of them would essentially fall inside of that 15 persons per acre of the acre-sized lot, unless somebody's got a huge family, which I doubt in those areas. So if that's the case, you could look at exempting those, or you could leave them in, whichever, I guess, would be at your discretion. If you wanted to exempt them, that means that these folks could theoretically be exempted from the zoning, and it would allow them basically to do what they wanted. They still have to come before the permitting process and whatever process would happen, but it would not pertain to the airport. It would be whatever kind of construction permitting that they would have to go through. Or you could leave those properties in as far as the zoning is concerned, which means that the JASB, and then in the future would be the enforcement of the zoning ordinance, would be in full effect or full enforcement over these properties to preclude anybody from coming in and buying up all those properties and putting apartments or something else out there, which seems crazy, but it has happened.
Go ahead.
Are these people, if we exempt, are they still under a height restriction? They still are, aren't they?
They are still under a height restriction.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
All of these properties currently are, or they were there before the 1984 restrictions were put in place. So
Even the structures,
I believe so.
like these structures in this subdivision, I believe all those were a little bit more
Were they?
as of late,
Okay.
after 1984.
Okay.
How come, like the space between 6 and 5 is not highlighted or called out, and then there's other ones too?
That's a good point. The reason that this one was not, and the other ones that are out here are not, is because there wasn't any real reason to even talk about exempting those, because they are all compliant. They don't have structures, there's no issues. This is a residence basically that's outside of that area, so there really wasn't any issue with that property. So what would happen, the way you have to interpret this, is those properties would actually fall under the jurisdiction of the zoning update. It's just the ones that are colored that we'd be under consideration for exempt for various reasons. Probably the most important ones in terms of this drawing are going to be the ones that fall in Zone A. Those are the ones that are going to be a little bit more contentious in terms of trying to get those properties to be exempted through the MnDOT process. But I believe a solid argument can be made for most of them, if not all of them. Just the type of discussion that we just had. Yes.
Was parcel 1, wasn't that exempted or previously?
No. That property was essentially a subject of basically an exemption of the state clear zone. There was a clear zone exemption, which is not to be confused with what we're doing here. And the clear zone exemption was an exemption provided as part of the ALP update back in, I think, 1980 something, or I'm sorry. When was that? It was about 2000?
Early 2000s, maybe?
Early 2000s. But it was a different matter as to what happened on that property.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, could you explain again, differentiate again between what Mr. Clausen had said between 6 and 5, the one between, how is that structure different than, 5? And then you've also got structures in Zone B not highlighted as well. Could you explain that again?
Okay. All of these structures that are back in this area and beyond, basically are, they were measured in size and they are significantly more than 3 acres. And some of these that have these long, narrow ones that go back, they're quite large. And then I think there's a couple of bigger ones here on the end. We get closer and closer back into this area, we've got some issues. And the way that this lot was looked at is in the Zone A, this area, this small triangle that's actually in the Zone A area is not, it could be something that could be built on, improved, whatever the case may be. So the way to look at that lot in particular, that one would not be exempted to preclude that anything would ever end up happening in this area. It would have to come before the joint, or the board, the future Board of Adjustment down the road to determine whether or not you would choose to allow anything to happen in there or not, which if you enforce the ordinance, nothing could ever happen there. Now, the rest of it, when you get back into Zone B, since this is a single-family residence and so forth, would actually, it's compliant the way it is right now, and if it always remained that way, there wouldn't be any problems, but a way to ensure that it would always remain that way from a zoning standpoint is to allow the zoning, basically to go through as it's being proposed.
And you're saying that the number 5 wouldn't be compliant, that would need an exemption because of the building sizes or heights or the amount of people?
That one I'm gonna have to look into to find out what the situation was on that. It's barely over 3 acres. I would have to look at that and find out why we would be looking for an exemption
Okay.
on that property.
I'm guessing we may want to remove that one from the exemption list, because I don't see any reason why we would want that exempted.
Now, 6 is a little different matter, as we've talked about, because it looks like, and again, not knowing these properties all that well, but it looks like there is some sort of a outbuilding of some kind that falls inside of
Yep.
Zone A. So the only way that you'd be able to mitigate that would be is to hopefully try to exempt it.
Yeah, it looks like there's maybe a detached garage or shop that's it's kind of split in half by Zone A and B.
Is that it, your?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
These do get a little, I mean, you almost have to look at each one individually, and kind of look at what the situation is, but,
Is it correct to say that if we don't exempt them, some further action then is required to mitigate what is there?
if you don't exempt them, some further action, maybe,
Is there a violation then of the zoning ordinance? Or if we don't exempt them, what happens to like number 1 or number 4 or?
number 1 and number 4, and some of them that are in Zone A, what would end up happening is the commissioner would not approve that because there are non-compliant issues in the approach end of the runway. So what they would say is from exercising it from the standpoint of the state, if those properties weren't to be exempt, they would say, well, how are they going to be mitigated? And I don't think that anybody wants to acquire any of those properties, would be my guess, but that would be the other alternative that would probably have to be considered.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is there any other questions about that particular approach? That one's probably the more complex one, so we'll move on to some easier stuff. But But at any rate, what we'll do
Rosie,
is
did you-
we'll go back and
Just-
take a look at number 5 and examine that one and see what the scoop
Rosie,
is
did you have
there,
a question?
to be sure.
Yeah,
So,
actually, I do have a question. Because Safety Zone A before was 3,667 feet, and now it's 3,619 feet, that's affected this? Is that part of the?
yes.
The safety zone? So,
Yep, the old zoning was tied to what they thought was going to become the ultimate end of the runway. The zoning that is being proposed here is tied to the actual end of the runway, which is not slated, it's not even planned to change anywhere in the planning horizon. So there is a difference there of old versus new, based on, what was planned back then and what is existing today.
okay.
The whole runway, as part of that runway development project, the whole runway shifted as well. And that was a matter of some safety compliance up along the highway on the north end by Highway 14. So,
But therefore, these zones that have also shifted somewhat. Okay,
yep, that's a good way to look at
thank
it.
you.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions with that approach. One of the things that, the comments that was made in the last zoning draft that was submitted back in December, there was some questions about safety zones pertaining to the future crosswind runway, runway 927. So I wanted to take just a moment to talk a little bit about that and bringing back this drawing. This drawing was presented to the Airport Commission a couple of years ago, probably 2-3 years ago now. And what this drawing basically represents is kind of a representation of all the different safety zones and areas associated with that runway. Kind of remember that airspace drawing that I showed you and all those crazy lines in the middle? Well, this is more of a blown up version of it. So kind of wanted to show you and show the JASB a little bit about what these trapezoids are going to look like off the end in kind of a big picture sense. And then one of the other requests is to show the various different parcels of land and how those are impacted. So as you can see, we attempted to name, and again, some of these may have changed. I know I already see a couple of things, but for the purposes of tonight's discussion, just kind of wanted to at least change these because I think some of the farms that are off to the west, I don't know if many of those have changed. I know Thompson has changed a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, this should be a pretty accurate drawing. So what this represents is this would be kind of the zones that you would be looking for. We did have one, I wasn't able to find it, but I was going to show kind of where the new property lines would come out, but essentially the property line would come out almost all the way to this gravel road, County 12, and it would cut down and come back in again, and then come back up and interjoin with the red property line that you see here. So everything you see in yellow, you got your different safety zones, you got your runway protection zone, which is going to be right off the end of the runway. Next, you've got your clear zone, state clear zone. One is an FAA zone. The second one, which is a clear zone, is actually a state DOT zone that has to be monitored or enforced. And then the other zones that you see here is you have the state safety zone A and the state safety zone B, and how far those would actually extend out past, the runway. Same thing on this end. As you come down off the east end, kind of going toward town, you see the Hawbrick farm would actually have some property in here that really wouldn't be as bad. As a matter of fact, I think most of the RPZ in the clear zone would basically end right here, so I don't think that there would be much that would have to be acquired out there to the east. But you would have the zoning for which the zoning update would apply that would actually come out here in the zone A, would come out almost all the way, it would come out and go across Highland Avenue and then basically cut off at about Highland. And then from there on out for the rest of the distance, you'd have Zone B. Zone B would largely go over the farm field that's up here on this side and a part of the gravel pit. So that's why this area was actually chosen the way it was with that alignment, because it would be the least probably impacted or impactful to the community around the airport. So is there any questions about this?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Why was it moved so far west? I mean, it shows future residential development there. I mean, that's open space yet, right, to the east?
This area here?
Yes.
There was some discussion at one point about possibly developing this area, but what could happen is if this area was to be kept in 3-acre size cluster development, it would be acceptable to be able to develop that. And then it sounds like there is some proposals to develop this area on this lot, kind of up in this general area here. And if that were to happen, it's outside of Zone B or the future Zone B.
Right, and I guess that'd be outside the zone I'm talking about anyway, no matter what, but a basic basic east-west movement of that whole secondary runway, way east, it shows future development. Why was it moved so far west? I'm just curious. Because if you move it east, you take your clear zone, you get less of the school grounds. You know, you'd only then maybe touch a ballpark. Right now, you're getting several ballparks.
These uses that are out here, it looks like, is this a parking lot that's in here? I can't remember what the layout is here, but these ball diamonds and some of the rest of this are compatible uses. So there wouldn't be any problems with the way that is right now. And I think the one of the reasons that we want to keep it is we want to not go much farther east, so we didn't have to basically do any acquisition of either one of these farmsteads, Aubrick or the other farmstead that's to the north, that we'd be able to keep it fairly close to where the existing property line is today. So as far as going west, the initial runway, when it's put in, would end even shorter than this and wouldn't go as far out west, because it would basically be replacing the existing runway 422 in kind. And I believe that's right now defined at about 2,600 feet. So this would be a little bit shorter. What this was showing or representing is the ultimate build out, as if this was to be paved down the road, and it would be paved out at 3,300 feet is what was determined based on aircraft performance and things of that sort. But if it's only ever to be another crosswind turf runway, it would actually be shortened significantly, which would pull all of this in quite significantly.
So this is just planning for possible future?
Yep.
All right.
So the yellow lines that are between Thompson Farmstead and the one below, going east and west? Right, that's back where the runway is in the middle. Go to the up one, the thin yellow, what does that represent?
That would actually be what's called the building restriction line.
Okay.
And the building restriction line is essentially a height based on the primary surface of that runway width.
Okay.
And at that point, when you get out to the building restriction line, you start inclining or going up at a 7-to-1 ratio. And what the FAA's guidance is they want to see that if you're going to look at building anything out there, we're just going to set the height of any sort of structure at 25 feet. So what that line represents is going out at that 7-to-1 until you reach a height of 25 feet.
Okay.
And saying anything inside of that is an area that you want to be able to build.
Build on. Okay.
So.
Go
Are
ahead.
there any other questions about the safety zones and some of the rest of this? And again, if you look at, as we talked about with the exemptions, this is showing the west end, which would be on runway 9. And this is actually made to fit what we're actually zoning for. This is, that other drawing that I showed earlier is a little bit more blown out, so it's harder to get the perspective. But as you can see, that the zoning for this is just going for what the new turf runway would be.
So County State Aid 12 is further to the
West.
left
Yep.
on our screen? Okay, thank you.
Look at 9-2, or runway 27. 27 is about how we had it shown on that previous drawing that I showed you, and that's where I was mentioning the 3,300 feet was the worst case scenario shown on that other drawing, but we wouldn't be zoning for that. We'd only be zoning for the replacement in kind of the turf. And the wet, or the east end, is what this represents, and this is pretty much along the same lines of what we just had up there on the other drawing. So you can see as far as the ball diamond and the rest of it goes, it's even outside of Zone B. And then one of the questions that was asked is to be able to show the primary surface, and if you kind of look on this side here, this kind of, it carries through to all the other approaches as well, but we show was asked to identify what is the primary surface width of each one of the runways. So it not only shows it on the turf runway, but it also shows it on the primary runway, the paved runway. So go ahead and take a look at those drawings and you can kind of see where it's at. Now the width changes significantly on the primary runway. You can kind of see on this drawing here, it's 1,000 feet. That's the category of the runway and what kind of aircraft, uses that runway and so forth. On a turf runway, it's down to 250 feet.
So the existing turf runway is 250 also?
Yep. The existing turf runway would look a lot like this runway in terms of what the zoning should be for it. But the thing to keep in mind about the city at the time, back in 1984, did not zone for the crosswind runway. And that's kind of been a little bit of a sticking point, if you would, with MnDOT ever since. I don't know why. I guess we weren't around back in the 1980s, but if anybody remembers that, I guess that's what the rationale was. But I heard through somebody had mentioned to me, he's now retired, but he mentioned that it got pretty contentious, and that was one of the reasons why they decided.
That's when they expanded the runway, right? I think they lengthened it.
Yeah.
Primary runway
Right.
was the primary
was
focus at that
contentious.
time.
I like the 3,300 feet.
What's that?
I like the 3,300 feet.
I do too. I mean, but again, we gotta kind of go with what's practical for now. But I mean, if the 3,300 feet, was able to be done, that would be the first choice. But so, do you have any questions about that, about the crosswind runway, and about the zoning? What you have in your drawings and your handouts would be what we're zoning for. You'll note in there are no exemptions being requested because none are needed. Everything is compliant. Everything from a runway protection zone to a state safety clear zone to zones A and B. So everything is good that way. Now, it doesn't preclude, I guess, somebody coming before the city in the permitting process, and they should be advised if anybody comes to them with a certain proximity around the airport, like essentially this site that's up in here, they do need to come to the city about that, and they would be advised to submit their own 7460, which is an airspace review process initiated that the FAA will take up and start an airspace case analysis on that property, or whatever the proposed development is. So that would be required, just because of the proximity of that development near the airport. And that's regardless of zoning, that has nothing really to do with zoning. So. All right, any questions? Hey, buddy, want to go over some stuff on that, or, okay? Well, we'll get to the next part here.
Go ahead.
Sure. I add one more, that Belter Farmstead, and Keith, you know this too. Is there somebody on that? It's listed as a farmstead on the,
Yes.
there is, okay. That's all I need to know.
Where is that located at?
Here? Right.
Because I'm looking at it on the other map and it doesn't show much, but I'm missing a house.
That's currently being farmed. It's
being
rented.
Land is, but he was asking if somebody lives on the farmstead.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay. That answers a lot of questions if somebody's on there. So.
All right, next steps. I always kind of like to cross them off a list as we complete them. You can see a few of the steps have been kind of crossed off, so to speak, and the next step is going to be to submit the draft off to the state and for their review and comment. Of course, we'll get in an agreement that all of you, if you have any comments, we would certainly like to have those. If what is today, I guess we'll call it the 1st. If we could have them by, say, mid-February at the latest, that'd be great. Any comments that you might have? And then if we need to meet again, we could certainly do that. Or if you're comfortable with sending this out for MnDOT's review and comment, we could do that too. So I guess I'll work with Joe and collect any comments that you might have, and then we'll kind of go from there. And then the next step, once we get MnDOT's comments back, if there's anything monumental, I guess we could meet as a body and talk through that. But if it looks like it's more procedural, more kind of minor changes and so forth for the document, I think what we could do is get that document, make the revisions, get it out to all of you again, and then look to scheduling the first public hearing.
so I was going to ask, when do we need to make a decision on the exemptions?
The exemptions, I would say, would be something that you're going to want to decide, I guess, how to handle that in the process. I think probably the thing to do would be is to get the idea back as far as you as a group, how you want to approach this as far as MnDOT is concerned. Because at the first public hearing, we're going to kind of talk through all of this. And the idea at that public hearing would be is if an area or a property is going to be exempted, that we've made that call at that point, and this is what's being proposed. Now, you could change that based on the discussions at that public hearing, but you would be basing it on your decision and then also the comments that you got back from MnDOT.
Okay. So the ordinance document is considered by MnDOT without concern about the exemption issue?
No, the MnDOT will consider it after the first public hearing has taken place. Then what you have to do is you actually have to submit this off for a review, commissioner's review. And after that takes place, you have to schedule the second public hearing. And the second public hearing would be kind of that last opportunity for the public to come out and voice their concern, whatever the case may be. And that's where, at that point, once that has basically taken place, the next step would be is you would, as a body, would have to vote to basically adopt this zoning ordinance. So that's kind of the steps that are laid out here in the overall project schedule, where you can see where we are in the process right now. Is we're at this draft, and basically we're about where we need to be. You have the first draft going out to MnDOT toward the end of January, somewhere in that ballpark. First public hearing had shown for happening in February. That's probably gonna slip a little bit, so everything probably slipped out maybe about a month, so I don't think it's gonna be the end of the world, but, at the same time, this is where we're at, so you're gonna have your first public hearing, then this thing's gonna go off for commissioners' review and approval, have your second public hearing, and then you would adopt ordinance based on that. Any comments and so forth that got addressed out of that second public hearing?
Okay, so tonight, if I understand this correctly, we're being asked to either approve the submittal of the draft zoning ordinance to MnDOT or to give it further consideration and to forward any comments to you. We would have the option of meeting again to, I guess, discuss any items. So I'm looking for comments from the members of the board as to how you would like to proceed.
Well, I still have a question, you know, to kind of ask what you asked there. So as it stands, if we would submit it right now, just the way it is, we would be asking for exemptions on all those numbered zones, correct?
Correct.
Even A and B, whatever they fell in, whatever was shaded, we are asking for exemptions right now.
Right.
Okay, that's what I would need to understand.
But do I understand it correctly that in order to evaluate the ordinance, MnDOT does not need to know what properties we would recommend to be exempted?
They will need, that will actually.
Eventually they will, but
Well,
the
no, this
initial
is-
draft,
The initial
They-
draft will have the exemptions that you're requesting in it.
Yeah, so Dave, he's saying that the ones that we talked about, we're asking for an exemption.
okay, so that's how you would proceed, is that
Yes.
you assume that everything that you have colored, that we would be asking for exemptions for that.
Yes, the only, maybe just to kind of step back here. These properties, as we've kind of talked through tonight, from what I'm gathering, I don't think there's any reason to exempt either one of those. I think we can pull those off the exemption list. So those would fall under the zoning going forward, so you guys see it differently. What we discussed, and going through it, if those are compliant right now, there wouldn't be a really reason why not to just pull those off the exemption request and have that be part of the zoning, unless you see it differently.
And from a staff perspective, I would agree with Mr. Page that we remove them from the exemption list.
Comments?
I don't disagree, but I have some questions about the other end.
Okay, let's talk through it again, just to make sure we're clear, because
Let's
that's
stick
why
here
we're here.
right now, though, and let's make sure that
So
nobody has,
just to kind of maybe summarize again, these properties right now are more than 3 acres. Either one of those parcels. Now, they're owned by the same owner, but let's just consider them different parcels. Talk about each one of them. Right now, there's nothing, I don't know if that's a structure or what that is, but even if it is a structure, it's in Zone B, so it's okay. So the only piece that we're really talking about, just about where the bubble is here, that would actually be part of, or could be part of, Zone B. So that area would fall under the zoning ordinance update. So all the rules that go along with that, okay? So is it realistic to assume that they would do anything in that area that the zoning would be precluding them from doing what they want to do with that property? I don't think so. So there's no reason to keep that one in there. One, on the other hand, that one, okay, we've got the building in here, the building's okay. There's no problem with having the structure in there. But what's the issue is, would that building be added onto or expanded or put, made for a different use or whatever, that will all of a sudden become more than 45 people, essentially in that building at any one given time? I wouldn't think that would ever be the case either.
I want to clarify, how are those two properties currently zoned?
I would have to check to be sure because we're right at the outer fringes and I'd have to check the measurements to be sure, but I believe that they're pretty doggone close to being in Zone B right now.
Well, I believe portions of them are in
Yes,
Zone
I
B.
would, yeah, not 100% sure, but I would say 95% sure they're in Zone B right now. That's why, from a staff perspective, we feel we just zone those parcels, remove them from the exemption list, then we'd be done with the 1-5 end of the runway. Board's wishes, would we
Any
need a
thoughts
motion for
about
that,
that?
Brian, or what are your thoughts on that?
If they're removed from the exemption, it's not gonna change anything that's going on right now, today.
Right.
Nothing, there wouldn't be any impacts to those property owners at all. It'd just be that if they decided, I think the likelihood of anything happening here on the magenta is pretty slim. But it's possible that something else could happen up here about where the one bubble is. It may happen in the future, but that would be something that they could come to the board and present to the future. They could go to the zoning administrator first. And if there was any sort of a zoning issue that would preclude them from doing something up there, they could ask for a variance. And then it would be up to the Board of Adjustment to determine whether or not that zoning, that variance would be granted or not. And you could go through this same similar discussion that we're having right now tonight. At that point, whoever that Board of Adjustment's going to be down the road and go through that discussion and say, you know what, we're just gonna go ahead and allow that and approve that variance. And that's that board's decision
Okay.
and your prerogative to do that.
If I understand this correctly, if we take something out or make a change tonight, we could add it back in. We'll have an opportunity to add it back in at a later time?
No,
No.
Board of
it's
Adjustment.
it's exempt for all,
Forever, yep.
in terms of this zoning ordinance, is exempted from it. So that you could update your zoning ordinance down the road and decide you want to include them. But I guess my point is, how I just described the process would be probably the most advantageous way for the city to go. If you don't think that there's any reason to ask for exemptions on either one of these properties, which doesn't sound like there is any real reason to do that at this point, the Board of Adjustment could look at this area down the road, is say, for instance, the hypothetical, that they want to expand, they want to build a new building, and they want to put it right in that corner. Okay, so then what would happen is they could come to the Board of Adjustment and ask for a variance, and the Board of Adjustment could grant them that variance. That would be the way to handle it.
Chair, it should be noted, most likely these parcels are already zoned, so they're already subject to our zoning regulations. So by not exempting them, we're not changing anything.
Right.
So
I guess I'd like to know that, if they're already zoned. Because, you had mentioned that it's unlikely they'd want to build there, but I don't want to take that away from them if they'd want to. You got a structure there already, and if we're exempting that many other properties, I don't see any difference with this one.
I think they're different situations, excuse me, Mr. Chair. We're talking about industrial, commercial compared to low-density residential. They're vastly different uses.
Do you have any
I'm-
access to the existing zoning?
I have the ordinance, I don't know if I have the map, that's what I'm looking for.
Okay, because
We can provide some sketches of that,
okay,
just
because
so-
I do know part of Zone B hits, I know that one building. I'm certain about that.
Now, just to be clear, again, this area out in here could still be built on.
Yeah, it's
And-
beyond,
and
yeah.
No problem at all. It's just that if they wanted to put something right in that trapezoid, that's what would be zoning. But again, the Board of Adjustment could grant them a variance.
It's a bigger hoop to jump through, though. I think it's tougher circumstances that way.
But they would have a chance to when we go to the public.
So
And, apparently, we talked about talking to them prior to that
And we
even.
could go off of what they say there, that, obviously.
Yeah, so, I mean, they would have a chance to address it
Yep.
in a public meeting, right?
Board members, the existing safety zone B, remember, is larger than what we're proposing. So that, I don't have dimensions on this, but I would say, the existing, what they are under regulation for right now encompasses the building entirely, in, parcel 1. And then I would say is 2/3 of the building in parcel 2. So we are shrinking the requirements
they'd be
on their
gaining
parcels.
anyway.
Yes. So my recommendation still stays that we keep, or remove the exemptions from these 2 parcels.
Okay, could you share that information with the members of the board?
I can try to pull it up on the Elmo here.
Well, yeah, or after the meeting if you have a,
Need to make a decision today.
Mr. Chair.
yes.
I'd like to, what Mr. Stadheim said, I'd like to, or, he said over here, I'd like to hear what the landowner has to say if they'd be at the hearing. I mean, they may have no
Okay.
objections at all anyway.
Good.
But I would like to hear what they have to say.
So the dotted yellow line, that's what we're proposing today, and the solid line is what's existing now.
We're not talking much.
So, but it does, you can see the
Yeah.
building here,
Mm-hmm.
it's fully encompassed in, like, at about 2/3 in that purple parcel.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're proposing to contact the owner prior to,
Well, if they show at the hearing, is what I'm saying. And then
Could-
we'd have the ability, even after the hearing, to say, okay, now we want to exempt this when at first we didn't. We can change our minds, is what I'm asking.
I see a difference on your map there where it says parcel 1 was built in 1996, number 2 was built in 1990, and then I guess probably we'd be going over the draft at some time later, but on the draft here, it shows that parcel 1 was 1983 and parcel 2 was 1868. That could just be a typing
Yeah.
error.
Could be. Yeah, we'll have to.
Yeah, we'll look, okay.
Certainly go back and
Yeah.
edit these things, but yeah, that's a good point.
But, okay. Yeah, that's on page 15 of the draft, but, well, 11 of 24, I guess it says, also 15
But
of
if-
35.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. I
Well-
think if we proceed accordingly, though, this table would no longer,
Yeah,
I mean, it's just gone, because there's really no, compelling reason probably to carry that going forward.
Is it agreeable to the board to remove these 2 properties from the exempt category?
yeah, I agree with that.
Keith?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we go then to the other end of the runway?
Okay, I think probably the way to kind of look at this, just to recap again, is going to be that the parcels that we have identified that fall inside of Zone A that have structures, essentially, that are being picked up as part of these parcels. Because this parcel over here, as you can see, the parcel actually goes into Zone A, but there's no known structures that we're aware of that fall inside that area, so that would be part of the zoning ordinance for this parcel. Okay, so, but all of the other colored parcels that you see here have structures in there and I think we can make a case for each one of them individually, to ask for exemptions on all of those properties. Partly because some of them predated the zoning, which came first, and partly because of their proximity to the end of the runway on some of the other developments that are out there. So we'll do a deeper dive on some of the properties, but I think the crux of the matter is the properties that you see there is what we would advance and ask for exemptions on for Zone A. So are we in agreement on that?
Yes.
Yeah, I am.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Page, did we want to clarify on parcel 5? On why that's included as an exemption prior
Well,
to?
5 and 9.
Okay,
Like-
I was gonna kind of move on to Zone B, which parcel
My
5 would
apologies.
be in
Okay,
Zone
my
B.
apologies. Yep. Okay, let's take care of Zone A first then.
Yep,
Okay,
if we're in
sorry.
agreement on what we have listed on this sheet as far as what's in Zone A, if you look at your handout or in the drawing, you'll notice that in the remarks section off to the table, they're distinguished between what's in Zone A and what's in Zone B. So all of the ones that you see here that have the Zone A listed in them should match up with what we're showing on this drawing, which actually shows it would be 1, 8, 7, 2, 4, and 3. So if we're in agreement on that, I think we will. If somebody sees it differently or sees something else on this drawing that should be exempted. Let's just talk about Zone A for right now. Let's get full agreement, I guess, on Zone A.
Comments?
When you were just talking about, you were saying that on page 10 and 11, those are identifying the zones A and B? Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, it's on 10, 11. Yep.
Okay.
I think it's a good recommendation to exempt those properties. I mean, we don't really have a whole lot of choice.
I agree.
So could you repeat your recommendation again?
My recommendation would be is to move forward with the parcels that you have shown here, which to quantify them would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8, which are Zone A exemptions that we'd be asking for. We'll start with that to make sure we're in agreement there.
Comments?
I agree.
I'm just curious, and maybe you provided some information on this and I missed it, but on parcel 3,
Parcel 3 is kind of this odd shaped
Yeah.
parcel, according to the Brown County GIS
Yeah.
land server. It looks like this parcel has got this structure, which
Yeah.
is right alongside the road here. Looks like probably a machine shed of
Yeah.
some kind.
Yes.
If that's the case, that structure right there is what is the issue with that property.
so when you exempt it, though, that means there are no regulations from an airport standpoint. Is that correct?
No.
No.
Mr. Chairman, what that would mean is it would be exempted from this zoning, but from an airport's perspective, there's still height limitations and things like that regardless of this zoning. That the height limitations and what's out there still has to abide by. And again, if they plan to build anything out there, it would have to have a 7460, something along those lines that would have to be done on that proposed development, whatever it may be.
Okay, so could somebody come along and purchase that property, let's say on the north side of the road, and put a bunch of dwelling units in there?
No. And this is getting a little bit more advanced into our process here, but one of the things and one of the suggestions that I have seen other communities do is this property is only going to be exempted provided that it stays in its current form and use. If that changes down the road, then it's immediately brought back into the zoning enforcement. So in essence, they couldn't do anything on that property without you as a, well, not you, but it will be the Board of Adjustment re-examining it to see whether or not that's gonna be compatible. And if it changes, like, I don't think any of this would ever change from what it is right now and how it's zoned. But if it did change down the road, then all of the exemptions that you're asking for now would basically, or at least pertaining to that property, would be null and void.
If I read correctly, if a building, let's say it's in this, and we do exempt and it's in this, if it gets to a point of disrepair, it can be taken out too, 70 or 80%. You know, if it's falling down and nobody's maintaining it.
Yep.
Yeah, it can be taken out and then you can't build again.
Yep, correct.
In essence, we're just exempting the existing buildings. It's
Yeah.
not, we're not exempting any future.
Exactly, it's a good way to,
Yeah.
good way to put it. Yep.
Okay. Any thoughts about that?
I agree with the exemptions for each one of those properties, those 6 we were talking about, 7.
I would too.
Rosie?
Yes.
Okay.
If we have agreement there?
Well, let's talk about Zone B. Zone B, we have several lots that are in Zone B. A lot of them are developed. Some of them have some different things going on. This parcel 6 is kind of unique because it has a couple of things. It's a Zone A issue and it's also a Zone B issue. But we'll call it Zone A because that's probably the most restricted because of that small outbuilding, whatever it is, that basically falls just inside Zone. So we'll take that one, kind of push that one aside for a second. But I think we're gonna take a deeper dive, as Joe had recommended, we're gonna take a deeper dive into 5. I need to look at that one to find out whether or not that one even belongs in this list. I don't think it does. I think one of the reasons is right where this line cuts across here, Joe. I think there was some questions as to exactly where that lot line comes in. But regardless, I think that parcel 5 probably could be removed. I know that's the case down here in 9, that it falls just inside where the lot line comes together, essentially falls just inside Zone A. So that's what kind of drug that one in, but I think that one could be exempt, or not put on this list, or exempted either. I think that one could come off. So in essence, the way to look at this is kind of pretend that 5 is gone, 9 is gone, because I think both of those don't need to be exempted, because I think both of them are compatible. 9 is 3.5 acres, and 5 is 3.1 acres. So I think both of those are certainly meet the acreage site. So if that makes sense, there really isn't a whole lot here to leave in Zone B. All the rest of these properties that are in this area, all the way out here, would all fall under that zoning.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I see, if we're not gonna consider the other property parcels there, we might as well not consider these
Yeah.
5 and 9 either, because they're basically a similar use, similar structures.
Exactly.
And they currently are subject to the same zoning at the present time.
Yeah. I think when the team looked at it, they were just looking at it from the kind of the hard line, okay, is it inside those buffers and in those zones? And if the lines fall in there, okay, we got to throw it in there. And I think that's the way that they were looking at it. But I think there's every reason to exclude these areas from the exemption list, because I don't think they need to be exempted. And essentially, the use of those properties, of what they're doing out there, they can continue to do at their leisure. There's probably other zoning restrictions that the city has that would probably be more restrictive, square footage size and building size, you know, on top of their lots and stuff like that, that would be more restrictive than anything that the airport would have to do with those. So,
Yeah, actually, though, this is in Brown County, so. Okay, any comments? So we're in agreement that as to what will be exempted and what will not.
I agree. If 5 or 9 need exempting, they should be exempt.
okay. Well, they'll be taken off the exemption list.
Yeah.
So in essence, they'd be part of the zoning.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the right call, because I think regardless, I think you can make the argument on 9 because of where the lot lines come together, but the issue that you're gonna get faced with is his next door neighbor is gonna say, why don't you exempt me? And then their next door neighbor is gonna say, why don't you exempt me? You know, and that sort of thing. So, you know, you can exempt if there's good reason to do it. And which we've talked through, that you have great reasons when we're in zone A, but not so great when you get outside of zone A.
Okay.
All right, any other questions regarding the overall schedule? This does show us hopefully wrapping up the process. If we can kind of keep things on track by roughly end of summer, would be kind of the overall plan here. I think some of this can be accelerated a little bit once we get past the commissioner's review and the hearings and so forth, so we might be able to come out even a little bit ahead of schedule on some of these things. Joel, we did get an extension on the grant, which all this is tied to. So the federal grant, which the zoning is part of, we need to get kind of wrapped up here, hopefully sooner than later. I guess the only deadline that we'd be facing is by the end of the federal fiscal year, which basically ends in September, end of September of '22.
Go ahead.
Just one question, this is a little off of what we've been doing, but the cross runway, you know, we're gonna zone it for 3,300. But they're only gonna build, at first, it's just gonna be shorter, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
I would suggest that we consider only looking at going with the shorter runway of the turf runway for now.
Okay, the question I have though is if, you know, it's gonna be zoned for 3,300. If the airport then wanted to expand it, it's solely up to the airport to do that then, and
We'd be going
because
through
it's
this.
already zoned.
Well, we're
There'd be no
we're
hearing.
zoning for the shorter one, right, Brian?
We are gonna zone for the shorter runway, not
Not
what
the
you see
33.
on
Not the
this.
33.
For now?
We're gonna go with what?
Picture of that then? I mean, is that possible?
The drawings that are in your handout, those are actually showing the actual zoning.
They're showing the short
that
ones,
we're going
the
to be
large
zoning
single
for.
drawings.
Yeah, so if you look at the end of runway
It doesn't
09,
go across
that's
12.
exactly, yes, yep.
All right, I should
That
have picked
future
that
zoning,
up.
it's a good, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the way to approach that is gonna be that if the time comes for the city to look at investing in a paved crosswind runway, I think the timing is gonna be down the road quite a ways. And I think at that point in time, chances are you're probably gonna be coming back to revisit the zoning ordinance again anyway in that period. And what you would do is update it according to that new standard of what you're gonna be shooting for. I think right now, the primary focus would be is let's protect for what's immediately ahead of us, that eventually the existing this right now is a real contentious issue on the existing crosswind runway as far as the state is concerned from a safety standpoint. There's many issues with it, and again, getting back to, we talked about it earlier, that right now there is no zoning on that crosswind runway. And that's been kind of a bone of contention with MnDOT, going all the way back to the 1980s. So eventually what's gonna happen is they will probably require that the city close that runway. And the whole reason of going through this exercise is to protect for a replacement, because you don't want to, because otherwise you won't have any crosswind runway. And I don't think that that's the way to go for the city. I don't think that's the decision that the commission has made, and I don't think that is something that even this body would be willing to support. So you certainly don't want to take a step backwards and lose something. So the only way to do that is to protect for, and that's what MnDOT's going to require you to do, is protect for that new runway this time and make sure that nothing gets built incompatible, with the future use of that runway. Because what's happened out here is with all the subdivision and everything that's gotten built out here, built up in this area, that you've got Zone A issues and B issues. This end's not so bad, but there are issues out here, with some of the obstructions and so forth. So, plus, at the end of the day, after looking at the wind analysis for that existing crosswind alignment doesn't really match up with current wind conditions either anymore. It would be much more ideal to run more of a true east-west type layout according to wind coverage.
I think this is kind of what it,
Yeah.
this shows
Yeah.
this shorter.
No, I was going off the wrong one all the time, so. And that drawing was here just as showing a 33, that was in here because, for what reason?
Just to basically have a reference, I guess, as far as how far everything goes out. And that colored one,
Yeah.
to show you basically how far that Zone C goes out and what jurisdictions are actually impacted by it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the item before us is whether to send the draft ordinance to MnDOT for review or to allow further board consideration of the ordinance with comments to be provided to Mr. Page. Any thoughts about that? Okay, well, if no one else wants to venture an opinion, I don't see a problem with sending a draft ordinance to MnDOT to get their opinion on the ordinance. I don't think that commits us to anything. It just allows us to get their opinion. Is that correct?
Correct.
And with the changes that we talked about.
Right.
In regards to the exemptions you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Modify that, correct? When we talked about that we don't need to have some properties
Right.
as, right, okay.
Right.
Okay, well, we should probably have a motion then to approve that request or direction.
All right, I'll move to send it to the MnDOT for their comment as we revised it today.
Okay, do we have a second?
And I would second that motion.
Okay, discussion. Anybody have any comments they would like to make at this time? If not, I'll call the motion. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Next item of business. Or do you have something further you wanted to add?
Well, I was, Mr. Chairman, just going to reference the comments that came through last time. I think we've addressed or covered most of them, if not all of them. There was a question about Planning Commission becoming the Board of Adjustment.
Yeah, that's the next item on the agenda. So
Oh, okay. Perfect.
if the chair's all right, you could jump right in, Mr. Page.
Okay, that's,
Well, let me just, did anybody else have any other comments about the ordinance that they wanted to pass along? Maybe a little late to ask that question now. If not, let's go on to the next item then. And that is to consider the establishment and appointment of the Board of Adjustment. And I assume that that's the correct name, is
Yes.
Board of Adjustment. Okay. Do you have any comments you'd like to offer on that matter?
Sure, maybe just to kind of define it a little bit better for the JASB as to what we're talking about. This body, the Joint Airport Zoning Board, is essentially established to be able to come up with this zoning and to go through the draft and all the way through adoption zoning ordinance that we're talking about here tonight. Once that occurs, then the Joint Airport Zoning Board's duties as far as that zoning is concerned is complete. So the next step will be is, okay, once it is basically adopted, you have to look at who is going to be responsible for the enforcement of this thing going forward. And the enforcement part of it is really what's the Board of Adjustments part responsibility to do going forward. There's going to be a zoning administrator that essentially will be kind of that primary point person to when somebody comes for like a development at any end of the airport or proximity to the airport. The zoning administrator will take a look at that and say, okay, is this falling inside of one of those zones that we need to be aware of, whatever the case may be? How do we address that, and is whatever is being proposed compliant, with our zoning ordinance? And what essentially is kind of a fallback will be is the zoning administrator will make a decision and make a determination based on the zoning ordinance and their opinion on things. And if there is a dispute down the road and something that needs to be basically resolved, that the landowner is just really still dead set on doing whatever kind of development that they need to do, the Board of Adjustment there is a catch-all, basically to go back and review the case again and take a look at all of the facts and the zoning and everything else and then render a decision on that. So that's the function of that Board of Adjustment going forward. So partly that enforcement of the zoning ordinance and the evaluation of the decisions have been made up to that point. So that's where there was a question that came out of the last, or a comment that came out of last meeting, that can the City Planning Commission serve as that Board of Adjustment? And what I can say as a matter of convenience, I know there's a lot of municipalities that have gone that route and have opted to do that. More as a matter of convenience, that if you look at it from, okay, how often is that Board of Adjustment going to be dealing with anything at the airport? You might go 5 years, however many years. Some airports are very active and in some very urbanized areas where they're dealing with the issue quite frequently. But I don't really see that happening here. So if that's the case, you have to look at, okay, what's a body that's able to get together and hear the facts and hear this case out and make some sort of a judgment on it? What is the most prudent way to go? And that's where, like I said, I've seen a lot of communities do that. Now, you could look at possibly appointing another group of some kind. It's going to be at your discretion as a JASB to appoint these people before your duties are done as a group. So you'll have to determine what is the best course of action there. And just as I mentioned, a matter of convenience, there's a lot of municipalities that do it that way. Not to say you have to, but that's just preliminary, discussions that we've had, that it seems like that's probably the most appropriate thing to do here. So
Mr.
anyway, I just kind of wanted to kind of lay it out what this decision is all about.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I could add on just a little bit of what Brian was stating. It was staff's thought that this would be an appropriate appointment for the Planning Commission to take this role because it's a commission that's always appointed by the city. We wouldn't have to convene the city council to appoint these members or anything of that nature. And it's a commission that's always going to be there, regularly meets, and it would just be another task that they would take on in the instance that something would need to be visited. The thought is if we can keep our number of extra commissions and things down, and the Planning Commission regularly deals with zoning issues. However, they may not be airport zoning issues, but it is similar type work, and that was staff's rationale behind recommending that we go with the planning commission to serve as the board of adjustment.
Mr. Chair,
Sure,
who's on the planning commission? Can you name them?
sure.
The chair would probably be better able to speak at that than I would.
Yeah, I'm staff to the planning commission, so.
Okay.
Our chair is Ann Earl. Other members are Michelle Sellner, Mike Firth, Ashley Aukus, Dave Munson. I'm missing one female. How many do I got?
Didn't count.
Only got 5. Okay.
Well,
Art.
yourself.
No, I'm
No, you're
not.
not?
I'm
Okay.
just, I'm staff. Kate Mako.
Mhm.
And got 3 guys. Who am I missing?
And we don't list them on the website. Shoot.
Give me a second.
But they serve, or they're 3-year terms.
Yeah, 2-year terms, maximum 2 terms you can serve. So 4 years. No, excuse me, 3-year terms. 6 years is the maximum.
Appointed,
Appointed by the
Appointed
city
mayor.
council, yep. Or, yeah, by the mayor, approved by the city council.
Approved by the city council, yeah.
Mr. Chair, I got a question. So the city planning commission, how are they gonna be having jurisdiction then over some county areas supposedly?
Good question.
Um,
And how does that affect
yeah,
anything?
there are instances where our city planning commission has jurisdiction over the county already if they're within our orderly annexation, agreement areas.
And
So-
this is,
Yep.
okay.
Well, it's really something we already have in place. So Mr. Schnobber can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, so.
No, the city also has extended its subdivision regulations out into parts of Cottonwood and Milford Township as well. So that's, we have some jurisdiction with regards to those items.
Okay.
The final member of the planning commission is Larry Mack.
Okay.
If I might add, as well, this is a question I see come up a lot with municipalities after this has been enacted. The thing you keep in mind is this zoning update, this ordinance is actually enacted by you, which are the body that comprises all of those jurisdictions. So when you look at it from that perspective, this zoning really kind of transcends over all city, county, everything. So the Board of Adjustment is really calling the shots on what they see, and not speaking for the city, not speaking for the Board of Adjustment should only specifically be addressing what's in the zoning ordinance. So just a clarification on that. They're not representing county, city, anything else. It's the zoning.
Thank you.
Yeah, just some background. I was appointed to the Board of Zoning Adjustment in 1984. And I think since it was enacted, we met once.
Okay.
So
Dave, you've been around a long time.
maybe too long, huh?
And then I've got no problem with.
I guess we would need a motion.
Yeah, we probably should have a motion then, if that's the consensus of the group.
I'll move to accept the city planning commission as the airport board of adjustment.
We have a second?
Second motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And I believe that, do you have anything else you would like to share with us
Unless
tonight?
somebody has any questions moving forward, but other than that, we'll work with Joe to get the updates and so forth made. And we will put together another draft that is basically corrected with all these other things that we talked about tonight. And then we'll send that out. He can disseminate that among the group, and then we'll make the call to get this thing out to MinDOT then for the first review.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to thank the board. I know it's not a fun document to read, and I do appreciate all your time and serving on the board. It's an important thing that we're doing and trying to push this thing forward, so dedication in your time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there's nothing else, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.